Welcome to the Apple for the Teacher podcast, the true crime podcast that features the good apples and the bad apples within the school system. My name is Anna Thomas, a teacher and your host. So join me as I present school stories that are tragic, shocking, unbelievable, and outright bizarre. Hello, everyone. This is episode 7. Thank you so much for joining me today. So let's start with a preview of the stories today. Story 1 is the bad apple and is called Love Triangle. A brutal crime is committed, but who done it? Story 2 is the good apple and is called Bully Boss. Helen was granted a 6-figure settlement. What for? First, I'd like to give some shout-outs. My stats show that I have listeners from the US, the UK, and Australia. So if that's you, hello and thank you for listening. There are also people from Portugal, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and Romania. Hello to all of you as well. I'd like to be able to say your names and give you a personal thank you. So why not get in touch and let me know who you are for future shout-outs. The two stories in this episode have a common theme involving school principals. I will be departing from my usual policy of not naming the perpetrators of crimes. As the first story involves multiple perpetrators, it would be too difficult to use the pronoun he without causing confusion, so you will hear their names. Let's start with the bad apple. It will give details of crimes against individuals, including children, but I will not go into the graphic details and only include the pertinent facts. This story took place in 1979 in Philadelphia in the USA and revolves around a lady by the name of Susan Reinert. She was employed as an English teacher at the Upper Merion High School and had 2 children, Karen and Michael, aged 11 and 10. She was a divorced single mother. On the night of June 22nd at around 9 p.m, Susan and her children got into their orange Plymouth hatchback and headed toward Allentown, which was 49 miles away, intending to spend the night at a motel. She was booked the next morning to give a speech to the Allentown chapter of Parents Without Partners. But come morning, she never showed up for her speech. 3 days then passed. A man was walking through a parking lot and spotted an orange Plymouth hatchback sitting in the parking lot all by itself. It caught his eye because the rear hatch was wide open. He walked over, took one look inside the trunk, and then called the police. Officers found Susan's body, nude and curled up in a fetal position in the wheel well. Her hands were tied and her body was beaten and bruised. Despite an extensive search of the area, her children were not found, and to this day, they have never been heard of again. The subsequent autopsy specified the cause of death as an overdose of morphine. Susan and her children had planned to meet her boyfriend, William Bradfield, on the day of their disappearances. He was the chair of the English department at the same high school where Susan worked. Susan and Bradfield had begun their relationship in 1974, while Susan was still married to her husband. In March 1979, 3 months before she and her children disappeared, she told friends that Bradfield was going to marry her. Bradfield swore Susan to secrecy about their engagement, but while he openly declared to his colleagues, friends, and acquaintances that she was just a friend, nothing more, that there was no romantic interest or involvement. Susan did not know that Bradfield was also dating at least 3 other women at the same time and was actually living with another teacher from the same school. Susan had given Bradfield large sums of money to invest for her. She had $730,000 in life insurance, with Bradfield as the sole beneficiary. And she had changed her will to make Bradfield the sole heir to her estate, to the exclusion of her children. Bradfield convinced Susan to withdraw $25,000 on the pretense he was going to invest the money and earn a more lucrative return on the investment. But instead of investing the money, he gave it to one of his girlfriends, who was a former student at the school. She deposited the $25,000 into a safe deposit box. Susan was murdered shortly before the money was due to mature. Bradfield was charged with misappropriating Susan's money and was convicted of theft by deception and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Shortly after his release in 1983, Bradfield was rearrested and charged with conspiring to murder Susan, Karen, and Michael. Prosecutors claimed Bradfield had murdered Susan and the children for Susan's life insurance, and to keep her from finding out that he had stolen the money she had given him to invest. But he seemingly had an ironclad alibi. He reported that he spent the weekend with some swinger friends at a beach location. It had been speculated that some teachers at the Upper Merion School were involved in swinging sex parties. Authorities also believed that Bradfield had not acted alone, and this is where we need to look at 2 other suspects in Susan's murder. The police also arrested Wendy Ziegler on theft charges associated with the $25,000 of Susan's money that her boyfriend Bradfield had given her to invest. The prosecutors were trying to scare her into cooperating with them on the investigation, and they succeeded. She testified against Bradfield at his trial. The other suspect was J.C. Smith. He was a former Air Force colonel and the principal of the Upper Merion High School at the time of Susan's death. It was reported that Smith ran his school as if it were a boot camp and would wear his military uniform to the school on a regular basis. Nearly everyone at the school found Smith odd. Others said he was downright spooky. Teachers jokingly called him the Prince of Darkness. His own daughter and her husband, both heroin addicts, moved in with him 2 years earlier. In addition to being a heroin junkie, the son-in-law was a convicted armed robber who was out of prison on probation. About a year before Susan's disappearance and murder, Smith's daughter and son-in-law mysteriously disappeared, and they haven't been seen since. Smith was a hot topic of conversation at the school. There were many rumours floating around about swinging sex parties involving several teachers. Also rumours about devil worshipping and allegations that Smith was involved in the disappearance of Susan and her 2 children. On the morning that Susan's body was found, Smith had to appear in court on another matter. He was late for this court appearance, which was in a location not far from where the police were removing Susan's body from her car. So, is this a coincidence or not? Also found in the hatchback were a sex toy and a plastic comb bearing the name of Smith's Army Reserve Unit called Satan's Place. When the parents from the school found out that the principal and the staff were involved in a murder investigation, they angrily demanded action to be taken. Bradfield and those providing his alibis were immediately suspended from duty. Many rumours started circulating, including that the staff were involved in cults. Other rumours claimed that Smith had chopped up the bodies and then incinerated them at school. The school also became a victim of graffiti, with the words "Satan's Place" being painted on the walls. About a year before Susan's murder, a concerned citizen phoned 911 to report suspicious activity in a parking lot of a shopping centre. Police responded and found Smith involved in suspicious activity. A search of his vehicle found several loaded handguns, a hooded mask, and assorted burglary tools. They also found a syringe filled with morphine. You will remember that Susan had died of a morphine overdose. Police also searched Smith's home and found additional firearms, marijuana, a large quantity of prescription pills, and a security guard uniform and badges. There was also a large amount of pornography, 4 gallons of nitric acid, and some office equipment, all of which had been reported stolen from the Upper Merion High School. They arrested him for possession of drugs with the intent to distribute and for possession of the stolen property. Police also charged Smith with 2 armed robberies which had occurred some weeks earlier. The robber, dressed as a bank security guard, pretending to be picking up the day's receipts. The uniform matched those found at Smith's home. On the same day that Susan's body was found, Smith stood trial on the drug and robbery charges. Bradfield testified as a defence witness, trying to provide an alibi for Smith, who maintained his innocence through the proceedings. But the jury didn't believe Bradfield or Smith. They convicted Smith and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But that trial had nothing to do with the murder of Susan Reinert. Law enforcement continued working on that case, trying to put enough evidence together to arrest Smith, Bradfield, and hopefully both of them. They remained convinced that Bradfield and Smith were birds of a feather in the murder of Susan. The ongoing investigation lasted for 6 years. Authorities believed Smith had committed the actual killings, but Bradfield had orchestrated them. Smith's lawyer argued that Bradfield had deliberately framed him, but Smith was eventually convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He spent 6 years on death row until his conviction was overturned due to misconduct by the prosecution. Evidence was uncovered which cast doubt on his guilt. The evidence was allegedly unethically concealed by the prosecution during his trial. Susan's autopsy found grains of sand between her toes. You will remember Bradfield had given an alibi that he had been at a beach location when Susan went missing. Smith's lawyer argued that therefore Bradfield had murdered Susan, not his client Smith. This vital piece of evidence was withheld by Bradfield's defence team, and therefore Smith was released from prison. The prosecution ordered a retrial for Smith, but the State Supreme Court denied the request. Smith subsequently filed a civil rights lawsuit against his prosecutors, but the suit was rejected. Smith died of heart disease in 2009. Now, back to Bradfield. His trial lasted 5 months, with Wendy Ziegler testifying against him. The jury convicted Bradfield on 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences. While in prison, Bradfield tried to collect the $730,000 in life insurance proceeds, The insurance company refused to pay the money to him. Bradfield eventually died while in custody. He never admitted involvement in Susan's murder or her children's disappearances. The children were presumed deceased, but their remains have never been found. They were declared legally dead in 1987. And here we are, 40 years later, knowing that Susan Reinhardt was murdered, but not knowing if Bradfield did it, if Smith did it, or if they both did it, or if someone else did it altogether. The story still haunts people living today who had been connected to the case. We're now going to look at one of those people. Vincent Valatis was one of Susan's fellow English teachers. He was 27 at the time when he was caught up in the scandal. Today, he still reflects on what happened. Quote, "I don't think a day has gone by when I don't think about Susan and her children. They are frozen in time." Vincent was friendly with Susan and the circle of high school English teachers at the centre of the case. He was especially close to fellow English teacher Bradfield, but he had a fear of Smith and described him as the creepy school principal. Several other teachers, including Vincent, were with Bradfield at the beach on that weekend Susan went missing and could vouch for his whereabouts. But Vincent agonised over inconsistencies in his friend Bradfield's story and tried to get him to talk to the police. After consulting a priest, Vincent went to the FBI. He was a key witness at the trials that followed. "I had to work through the idea of betraying a friend." Vincent had kept what he knew about Susan's murder to himself for a very long time, but he was finally ready to tell his story to someone after Smith died. When he was alive, to me, he was somebody who was very dangerous. I didn't want him thinking of me. Don't you understand that I'm afraid of this man? There are a couple of things I'd like to say. I truly believe both of them were responsible for what happened to Susan. Vincent feels that he was manipulated and sucked in by a murder plot by someone that he trusted. Vincent has been teaching for 70 years now. He heads up the Upper Merion's English department, where his path first crossed Susan's and Bradfield's during the early 1970s. People ask him about the case from time to time. He said, "One of my main themes is to talk about being careful about psychopathic or sociopathic personalities. Be careful of people who flatter you. Be careful of manipulative liars." With the two suspects in this case now deceased, it may seem that the mystery around Susan's death and the disappearance of the children may never be solved. However, there is a glimmer of hope which may one day help solve the case. A photo had been found in Bradfield's prison cell. The photo showed a stone marker which resembled a person with a hood on. The stone is surrounded by leaves and there is a wooded area in the background. The photo was released to the public. Police believe the marker may have something to do with the missing children and could mark where they were buried. The photo was found in amongst boxes containing Bradfield's belongings. They also found writings that appeared to be written in some kind of a code, but so far the marker has not been able to be located. Oh, wow, that's the end of that story, a very complicated and intriguing story. I think the evidence, in my thoughts, that the two men were both involved in the murder and the disappearance of the kids. Bradfield backed up Smith at his trial, but then when both men were forced to turn on each other, because the police were just getting too close, so they couldn't keep up with the lies. I think that they wanted to split her money, and that was the whole reason for the whole thing. So let's now have a break before story 2. Now we go on to story 2, The Good Apple. Firstly, allow me to provide a warning that this story involves mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, and PTSD. This story takes place in Australia. Helen Francis, who doesn't wish to use her real name, was a teacher in a New South Wales school. She described the school as having a wonderful environment and a good collaborative staff culture. But it was the arrival of a new principal in 2011 when things began to change. She noticed a drop in school morale, and the workplace culture soon turned negative. Staff became disengaged and unhappy with the undue pressure being placed on them. She said, "It wasn't just me. Most teachers were unhappy. Staff used to be totally committed, but with the new principal, they totally withdrew." So she decided to raise concerns about the workload and morale. What resulted was a change in principal and staff behaviour towards her. Helen said she started hearing negative things about her being circulated among the staff, and other teachers soon began ignoring her in the staff room. She began to feel that by speaking up, she had set herself up as a target. She stated, "It was a very sinister form of bullying where you start to isolate the person. I'd go to the staff room and sit next to someone and just say hi, and if the principal came in, they would get up and move." She described feeling like she had been outcast via a psychological process known as mobbing, where she became isolated by the principal's words and actions, which led to her colleagues ignoring her out of fear of retribution. Helen said that the principal would humiliate her in front of other teachers and even the students. With staff present, he suggested that she should be made redundant. Helen said, quote, "The people who would generally you would turn to if you needed support in the classroom or ideas on how to work with children, you just couldn't have those conversations anymore. You're no longer included. I can't even begin to explain what that does to one's entire psyche. Initially, I started getting sick, getting colds, and my immune system went into decline. I started having nightmares and suffering from anxiety. When left alone with the principal, I would shake physically. I was trapped in a toxic environment and was also having difficulties financially. I was the main breadwinner, and it started affecting everything around me, including my relationship with my husband. And I didn't have any other option for employment. I was being blackballed. I eventually tried to commit suicide. It left me with no other option. I felt like I was a burden and not of any use to anybody." Despite being at the lowest point in her life, she managed to seek medical attention and was diagnosed with PTSD, anxiety, and depression. "My doctors have told me the impact that PTSD has had is similar to suffering an acquired brain injury," she said. She also eventually decided to consult a lawyer and made a workers' compensation claim. Her lawyer started investigating a work injury damages claim and a claim of negligence against the school. The lawyer stated, quote, "One of the tests is that the injury needs to be of a certain severity. The threshold is a whole person impairment of 15%. Mrs. Francis was medically assessed as having a severe injury. Her whole person impairment was determined to be 22%. They assess how well the person can function in their daily life, their ability to take part in society, maintain family or close relationships, care for themselves, and work. It was found that the school didn't act appropriately to eliminate the risk to Helen of her psychiatric injury. Quote, given they were aware of her deteriorating condition, the school should have introduced measures to eliminate the risk to her, the lawyer said. The parties went into compulsory mediation and reached a 6-figure settlement. Helen stated, quote, in some ways, the ordeal was a blessing in disguise because it prompted her to leave the school and seek medical attention. Teaching was something that Helen really loved. It wasn't just a job. She has never been able to overcome the ordeal and won't ever return to teaching. She said, I still don't cope. I can't really go out and be around many people. I avoid going too far from home. The real shame is that I loved what I did. I didn't consider it work. It was a calling, and now I can't do it. The lawyer stated that the settlement would help bring to a close a 6-year battle for the mother of 2 who had given her life to teaching. This has been an extremely traumatic time for Helen and has had an enormous impact on her professional and personal life. In this case, we were able to prove the emotional and psychological destruction that had so clearly resulted in Helen's current condition. Anyone suffering workplace bullying should seek help because no job should have a negative impact on a person's life. Helen now dedicates her time to making more people aware of bullying in the workplace, especially in teaching and nursing. She has started writing a book to create awareness and wants to turn her negative experience into something positive. She says, the only way to deal with workplace bullying is to proactively address negative behaviours. A lack of leadership allows bullying behaviours to thrive. Workplace bullying is about a complete system breakdown that needs to be addressed as quickly as possible. If this story has been difficult for you, please seek help. And that almost brings us to the end of this episode. I'd now like to give you a preview of episode 8. It's called I Spy with My Little Eye and Time Bomb. Here's a summary. Why was Big Brother watching Blake? Who was the strange man outside the school gate? I would also like to give you a preview of other stories still to come on the podcast. You will hear about a teacher suicide, a teacher accused of sexual misconduct, a tragedy on school camp, the disappearance of a student, the cover-up of a student murder, a teacher buried in a bath, a transgender teacher, student suicide, a body unearthed in a school, and a runaway bus. If you have a few minutes, have a look at the Facebook page and Instagram, where you'll see lots of great photos on the stories covered so far. So to end this episode, I will leave you this quote. Your best teacher is your last mistake. Bye for now, and remember to be a good apple.